They didn't choose you because you were weak. They chose you because you were strong in ways they couldn't understand. You carried silence like a sword. You forgave when others would have fought. You showed patience where pride would have erupted. And they needed that. They needed your calm, your certainty, your light. But the truth is, they didn't want to grow beside you. They wanted to consume you, to study your strength just long enough to find its soft spots. They never loved you for your light. They wanted to own it. And when they couldn't, they did the only thing they knew how to do. They tried to break it, not because you were wrong, but because you reminded them, quietly, effortlessly, of everything they had buried. That's why they needed you, not to walk with you, but to wear you down, not to rise with you, but to dim what they couldn't understand. You were never the problem, you were the mirror, and they couldn't bear to look. The mirror they couldn't face. They didn't need an enemy, they needed a reflection, and that's what you were. A mirror they couldn't control, couldn't dim, and couldn't distort. You walked in with no intention to threaten, no hunger for power, no mask of competition. But your very presence said things out loud that they had spent years trying to silence. You didn't raise your voice, but your silence screamed. You didn't brag, but your integrity echoed. And in that quiet, unshakable truth, they saw every part of themselves they tried to bury. That's why it started, not because of what you did, but because of who you are, and what that forced them to see. They needed you, yes, but not for love, not for growth, not for light. They needed you so they could project their guilt onto something outside of themselves. You became their canvas of blame, a place to unload their own unhealed wounds. They couldn't stand beside you without feeling small, not because you tried to shrink them, but because they had never grown. Your calm exposed their chaos, your focus highlighted their distraction, your empathy, strangely enough, became the source of their envy. So they did what the insecure always do when standing in front of someone real. They turned their discomfort into attack. Slowly, subtly, like rust on metal, they chipped away at you with criticism disguised as concern, with backhanded compliments, with passive comments that questioned your worth. Not because they didn't see your value, but because they did. And they couldn't live with the fact that someone like you could exist without needing validation, without bending, without performing. So they tried to bend you, tried to make you question the very things that made you rare. Because if they could distort your mirror, maybe they wouldn't have to face their own. Maybe if they could damage your peace, they wouldn't feel so tormented by their noise. It wasn't about you. It was about what you reflected. And that's the hardest part. You thought they cared for you. You thought they admired you. But deep down, they only stood close so they could see their own reflection a little clearer. And when that reflection became unbearable, they didn't walk away. They shattered the mirror and left you wondering what you did wrong, when all you ever did was be honest in a world addicted to illusion. That was your power. That was your curse. You didn't destroy them. You revealed them, and for that, they tried to destroy you. They fed on your silence, not your mistakes. It wasn't your flaws they circled. It was your silence, your refusal to play their games, your ability to walk through chaos without shouting back. That's what confused them. That's what threatened them. You see, loud people expect noise. They expect retaliation, but you gave them none. You didn't explain yourself to be understood. You didn't scream to be heard. You let your character do the speaking, and to people built on drama, that is the most unbearable kind of confrontation. They were watching you closely, waiting for you to stumble, to slip, to snap, so they could justify the war they had already declared against you in their mind. But the mistake never came. The breakdown they predicted never showed, and that silence made them restless, because your peace didn't just calm the room, it exposed the ones who had none. You became a mirror without words, a presence that reflected their unrest simply by standing still, and because they couldn't label you, they started to twist you. They began to rewrite your silence into arrogance, your kindness into manipulation, your self-respect into pride. Not because you gave them reason, but because they needed a reason to excuse the envy they couldn't shake. That's what it was all along. Envy, dressed as concern. Resentment, wrapped in fake support. So they poked. They pushed. They provoked you, not because they hated your mistakes, but because they hated that you made so few. They wanted to see you crack. They wanted to see you fall apart. Because if someone so composed could be broken, then maybe their own brokenness would feel a little less painful. They fed off the hope that one day you'd react, that one day you'd break character and give them ammunition, but you didn't. You just kept showing up, calm, quiet, unmoved, and that made them furious. Because the world doesn't understand restraint. It mislabels stillness as weakness, silence as guilt, but you knew better. You knew that silence is power, that stillness is control, that real strength isn't proven by how loud you scream, but how little you need to. And because they couldn't figure you out, they decided to destroy what they couldn't define. They turned your peace into a threat, your presence into a problem, not because you changed, but because they realized they never had control. And in the minds of those who feed on control, that is the ultimate betrayal. You were never the villain. You were the calm in the storm, and that's why they tried to drown you, not because you caused chaos, but because you refused to become part of theirs. You became their stage, not their partner. They didn't want a partner. They wanted an audience. And you, with your quiet loyalty and your depth of heart, were perfect for the role they had already written. You weren't brought into their life for balance. You were brought in to applaud, to nod, to make them feel larger than they were. They didn't seek your companionship. They sought your spotlight, because deep down they knew they had no light of their own. You didn't realize it at first. You thought it was love. You thought it was connection, but it was performance. Carefully rehearsed, emotionally manipulated, perfectly timed performance. And while you stood there, listening, encouraging, loving them as they were feeding on the attention you gave, not the bond you tried to build. You thought you were walking together, but the truth is you were always behind them. Always watching, always supporting, never seen. They needed you there, yes, but not beside them, beneath them, and the more you gave, the more they took, until your needs became interruptions, your voice became noise, your pain became inconvenient. They didn't want to hear your monologue. They only wanted you silent between their acts. And what's worse, you accepted that. You convinced yourself that maybe this is what love looks like. Maybe loyalty means staying even when the script hurts you. Maybe being the strong one means letting yourself fade so they can shine. But the truth is, you weren't being loved. You were being used for your empathy, used for your patience, used for the kind of emotional safety they never planned to return. Because people like that, they don't build bonds. They build stages. And the moment you ask for light of your own, the show changes. Suddenly you're called selfish, dramatic, too much. The moment you stop clapping, you become the villain in their play. That's how fragile their identity is. It only survives when others are watching. And you, who once held the curtain open for them, who once protected their performance with your silence, now become the threat. So they rewrite the story, they twist the ending, and they make sure you exit not as the one who gave, but as the one who broke things. But deep down, you know the truth. You weren't the show. You were the soul behind it, the foundation they stood on, the one who made the stage even possible. And while they try to paint you as replaceable, they'll come to learn. There is no script that feels real without someone who truly listens. They didn't just lose an audience, they lost you, and no spotlight can ever replace that. They needed your light to hide their darkness. They didn't need your help. They needed your glow, not to admire it, but to hide in it. You see, some people don't come close to you because they want to grow. They come close because your light gives them cover. Your goodness gives them camouflage. As long as they stand beside someone kind, someone honest, someone clean, they don't have to confront who they truly are. You became their excuse, their shelter, their mask, and at first it felt like connection. It felt like loyalty, but slowly you noticed something strange. They weren't growing near you, they were shrinking you. You were dimming to protect them, you were holding back your brilliance just so they wouldn't feel exposed. They convinced you that your light was too much, too intense, too pure, and out of love or guilt or some misplaced empathy. You started to believe them. You started to lower your standards, soften your tone, question your clarity, all to keep them comfortable. But the truth is, they never wanted comfort. They wanted control, and nothing is more threatening to someone who lives in shadows than a person who shines without trying. You didn't preach, you didn't boast, you just were, and that being was louder than anything they could pretend to be. Your presence reminded them of every lie they told themselves. So instead of healing with you, they tried to handle you, contain you, diminish you. They couldn't celebrate your light, because to do that would mean facing their own darkness, and they weren't ready, so they rewrote the story. They called you arrogant, dramatic, impossible to please. They tried to make your standards seem like flaws, your clarity seem like coldness, not because you were wrong, but because you were right, and rightness, in the presence of someone dishonest with themselves, is dangerous. So they decided if they couldn't reach your level, they'd lower your altitude. They'd dim what they couldn't match. They'd shame what they couldn't control. And by the time you realized what was happening, you were already running on a dimmer setting, trying to protect someone who never planned to protect you back. That's when you learned your light is sacred. It is not for rent, not to be used as a hiding place for broken people who refuse to heal. You are not a flashlight for those who insist on walking blindfolded. You are a flame, and those who truly belong with you will never fear it. They will stand in it, grow by it, rise with it, and until they do, you must burn anyway, because the truth is, they didn't want your light to guide them. They wanted it to make their shadows look less dark. And that, my friend, was never your job. You were the test they couldn't pass. You didn't come into their life as a challenge. But that's what you became, not because you competed, not because you compared, but because you exposed them without even trying. Your discipline, your consistency, your emotional maturity, these things quietly set a standard. And for people who have spent their entire life avoiding self-awareness, that's threatening. You became a living reminder of everything they had avoided becoming, and instead of rising to meet you, they tried to reduce you. You were a test, one they never studied for, one they never wanted to take, and one they blamed you for failing. They couldn't match your effort, so they mocked your intentions. They couldn't mirror your honesty, so they questioned your motives. They couldn't carry your peace, so they stirred chaos just to feel in control. You didn't walk around acting like you were better. You simply moved with purpose. You honored your word. You stood up when it was easier to sit down, and that quiet strength, they couldn't stand it, because it meant they had no more excuses, no more places to hide. Your existence put a spotlight on everything they refused to fix, and instead of being inspired, they chose resentment. It was easier to pull you down than to climb. Easier to accuse you than to admit they were never ready. You became the test, and not everyone wants to be tested, because a test demands growth. A test reveals truth, and most people are still clinging to lies that keep them comfortable. They didn't want to change. They wanted comfort, submission, a mirror that flattered instead of reflected. But you showed up with honesty, with standards, with presence, and that made you dangerous. Not because you harmed, but because you healed without begging, because you walked with depth in a world obsessed with surface. So they labeled you intimidating, difficult, too much, but what they really meant was, you were too awake for their dream, too whole for their games, too conscious for their denial, and instead of rising to the occasion, they tried to rewrite the entire test. You were never asking for perfection, you were asking for effort. But effort is something people only give when they believe in who they are. And deep down, They didn't, so they tried to break the test. Break you, not out of hate, but out of inadequacy. You reminded them of who they were supposed to become, and that's why they needed you, just to ruin you. Because if they could destroy the example, they wouldn't have to feel the shame of never becoming it. But here's the truth they can't escape. The test is still there. You're still standing, and whether they passed or failed says nothing about your worth, and everything about who they really are.